Yeah, obviously we're doing the history of the graphic novel more than superheroes and spandex, but we will talk about superheroes and spandex. And obviously that's me. I thought it'd be fun to put my little self in there because graphic novels do deal a lot with first person point of views. So yeah, just very, very briefly, my background, you know, Kim covered a little bit. I'm actually originally trained as an architect, but then I became a reporter writer. And right now, my day job is I'm a communication specialist at Princeton. And actually that's how this lecture came about, is that I did a Princeton winter session workshop on making mini comics for students, and they reached out to me and I said, sure, why not? And also I really enjoy spreading the word about comics, sequential art, graphic novels, and obviously visual narrative and storytelling that where it's just not just words but pictures, obviously. Oh, and sorry, that was having a little technical issues. Anyway, so I'm actually working on a webtoon or a webcomic about immigration, and these are just like a couple of panels of what I've been doing. So you can see that, I'm really not just interested in talking about the craft, but interested in practicing it. And I'm actually the artist for this, and my friend Hallie Bondi, who's a reporter, is a writer for this, Sophia the Craigs. It's about basically refugees and undocumented immigrants at the southern border. And here's another clip. And anyway, so this is just like a very quick overview. Even though the lecture is called The History of the Graphic Novel, it's really more about the history of visual narrative spanning, the like late 19th century to 20th century and up to our time. Or basically it's how graphic novels evolved from comic strips and regular comic books. And obviously we're going to touch spandex and stuff. But, it's just, it's more than just graphic novels, basically. And I think really this kind of like graphic novels, the evolution of graphic novels and sequential art is really about, how people are really into, visual storytelling, or man's capacity for story, putting together storytelling and art, which is kind of like an age-old, art form. And even though there have been times it's been denigrated, it's still really, really important. And I also always like to quote like Alice in Wonderland when she wrote in chapter 1, Down the Rabbit Hole, "What is the use of a book, thought Alice, without pictures or conversation?" So I do love books with pictures. And I know sometimes people don't think, they look down on comic books and graphic novels, but they're a really important product of our time, and that they're a great tool to tell stories, to for journalism, for example, for the best we can do, or a hidden subject, or like subjects that are really hard to explain or convey, such as the Holocaust, for example. Anyway, so we'll start from the very beginning. So I always think that comic books or graphic novels started with cave paintings. And this is just one such example. This is from Chad in the Sahara Desert. It's about 8,000 years old. They're just basically cave paintings from the Anida Plateau located in Northeast Chad. And as you can see, we've always been, as humans, we've always been interested in how, we've always been interested in conveying our world through pictures, and I always think back, like when I'm drawing, I'm basically hearkening to that, tradition of like mark making. Okay. And here's another one. This is from Indonesia. It's considered probably the world's oldest recorded story. It's basically a group of hunters hunting down buffalo, and these buffalo are called anoa. And some researchers say that this cave drawing is 44,000 years old. Okay. And also this, it looks like an ordinary rock, but it's scientists think this is humanity's oldest known drawing from a small fragment of rock in South Africa. And it basically shows a cross-hatched line sketched onto stone with red ochre pigment. And scientists have, carbon dated it to 73,000 years old. So we've always been interested in mark making. So, and I always think about, as I said before, I always think about that when I'm drawing, is that there's like a really natural impulse. And what's interesting is how, with the times, depending on the taste of the era, of the spirit of the era, like mark making or drawing has been seen either as vulgar or poor taste or out of fashion, like certain types of mark making. But we're still always compelled to basically draw and tell stories. Anyway, now we're gonna skip a lot like probably tens of thousands of years into the future, into bio tapestry, which was obviously an embroidered cloth nearly 230 feet long and 20 inches tall. And I really think this is one of the earliest pieces of sequential art, or kind of like a proto-comic, proto-graphic novel. Obviously, it shows the Norman conquest of England. And what's great about it is it tells the story chronologically, through all these panels. And I always think a lot of comic book or graphic novel scholars always look at this as, like I said, as a bit of proto comic book making of a graphic novel or sequential art. And what I mean by sequential art is that's another like kind of scholarly term that a lot of researchers use, because it explains itself. It's art or a story told in sequence. And that's what probably the most essential definition for comic books or graphic novels is sequential art. So people have always been compelled to tell stories, but we've also been compelled to tell them sequentially, and here's another example. This is called the Pauper's Bible from the Middle Ages, obviously. And basically there were these Bibles that were not too text heavy. I mean, it was a melding of text and images. And what was interesting about these Bibles is that, scholars think that they're kind of like also an example of proto comic books, because you have these figures with scrolls, and these scrolls are kind of like their thought bubbles, or their dialogue bubbles that you'd see in a comic book. So you see, like, there's an angel in one of these panels with a scroll coming out of its mouth, or near its mouth, so to speak. Okay. So that's another example. But now we're going to jump forward again in time, where we have William Hogarth. He was this really famous English painter and printmaker who was born in 1697 and died in 1764. And a lot of comic book scholars also see him as kind of like a proto comic book artist, because he made these paintings that were pretty famous, and they were they basically dealt with moral subjects. And one is most famous is A Rake's Progress, which is, and this is like an example from that. And A Rake's Progress is basically a series of 8 paintings that were made into etchings about basically Tom Rakewell, this really basically like this rich, basically their version of a rich frat boy who wastes all his money on gambling and prostitution, and how he comes to ruin, basically. And what was interesting about this set of artwork was that it started off as paintings, but then he made them as etchings, and he sold them like to the masses. And it's kind of like a precursor again to the comic book graphic novel. But anyway, we're going to jump forward in time again to the adventures of Mr. Obadiah Oldbuck. And a lot of comic book scholars consider this to be the first comic book. Oldbuck is commonly referred to as the first comic book. And it's basically, again, like this sequential art. Sequential art is basically a set of pictures and words detailing the story and misadventures of this guy named Obadiah Oldbuck. And it's from, where was it published? It was created in 1827, actually, and published first in Geneva, Switzerland. And it was also pretty popular, but a lot of people think this was considered, well, the first comic book. But hold on, let's scroll. Let's go. So anyway, even though it was considered the first comic book, it obviously doesn't resemble the comic books or graphic novels that we think of right now. And in fact, comic books were originally basically a collection of comic strips that were called for newspapers. And comic strips came about in probably in the late 19th century, and they were like, obviously they were, comic strips, the funnies, they detailed funny things, and one of the first ones were the Yellow Kid, which is this American comic book strip character. It appeared from 1895 to 1898. And it's just basically this weird looking kid who did funny things. Like in this comic strip, he was experimenting with hair tonic. And unfortunately, some of those comic strips that he's featured in is pretty racist, but I guess it reflects the times. But he was widely popular, and so widely popular that people would take the comic strips and basically collate them together into a book, which became the comic book. And those were the first comic books. And they were basically, and these comic books are the ones that resemble the most what the modern or contemporary comic book or graphic novel look like. Okay, so here's an example of Yellow Kid experiments with a wonderful hair tonic. Okay, and it wasn't just a Yellow Kid. There were a lot of classic comic strips that came out around this time, such as, here's another Yellow Kid strip. The Yellow Kid takes a hand at golf, and as you can see, it's pretty racist, like the way they characterize Black people. And even I think the Yellow Kid looks really disturbing in of itself. So anyway, so another classic comic strip that came out in that period was Little Orphan Annie, and I know a lot of people know about that. But anyway, so this was around when it's around this period. What is it, like the late 19th century to into the 1930s, where people were really big into comic strips, and they started collecting these comic strips into books. Okay, and of course these books started looking like the comic books that we know, that we're pretty familiar with. Okay, and that's when and it was around this time that we start to see something that we're very familiar with, which are, basically comic books, superhero comic books. And so in 1938 was a huge turning point in comic books, where these artists, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, basically came out with Superman. And a lot of people think that the first superhero comic was this one, Action Comics, that appeared in June 1938. And this ushered in the period called the Golden Age of comic books. Okay, and this is where a lot of famous characters came out, particularly from DC, obviously from DC, like Superman. I think Batman came out around this time, Wonder Woman, and obviously these appeal to kids who are, teenagers, young kids, grammar school age kids, and young adults. And I think a lot of these comic books kind of reflected the time with, our anxiety with, this was, with the World War and everything. So we're not right now in the golden age of comic books. And that's what a lot of people call them, because that's where comic books were not just these like stupid little comic strips, but they started to deal with like these multi-arc stories. And you have these like iconic characters now. And of course, we have Captain Marvel was part of the golden age of comic books. And then we have Wonder Woman. She came out around that time too. So even though comic books were insanely popular, during those years, there was some trouble ahead. So we have the golden age of comic books, and not only were people consuming superhero comic books, people were also reading comic books on mystery and romance. But then there was like this kind of like bit of moral panic in the 1950s, whether comic books were contributing to juvenile delinquency. And this guy named, the psychiatrist named Frederick Wertham came out with this book called Seduction of the Innocent, the influence of comic books in today's youth. And basically said that he claimed that comic books were responsible for an increase in juvenile delinquency, as well as a potential influence in the child's sexuality and morals. And because of that, people were up in arms. There were a lot of, article writing about it. It kind of resembled how people were upset with video games and how they would basically corrupt people. So what happened was there was this industry-wide rallying organization to basically set up a kind of a self-enforcing code to make sure that comic books did not fall into that trap, and so because basically they didn't want to be regulated by the government. The comic book industry put together the Comics Code Authority in 1954 and drafted basically a self-censorship comics code that year. And they basically required all comic books to go through a process of approval. Oh, when did comics begin to appear in newspapers? I'm looking at the chat. Sorry, guys. I think they started appearing in the late 19th century, basically. And they were a huge draw for newspapers because, if you remember, like for the Sunday newspaper, even until recently, we would have comics in the first part of the newspaper, and then you get, basically newspapers operate by, we give you what what you want, and then we give you what you need. So they would use comic strips as a way to lure people into reading the newspaper. And that's not so much anymore, unfortunately. So anyway, let's get back to the comic code. So anyway, basically the comic industry put together kind of their own self-censorship comic code, and that they required all comic books to go through this process of approval. And so this came to pass, and people really hated this code, by the way. And the code was made formally defunct in November 2011, that recent. But anyway, so because the comic code, publishers abandoned comic books that were about romance and mystery and more salacious topics, and went back to printing more superhero comics. And that's when we segue into silver age of the comic book. And basically this is a period of artistic advancement and widespread commercial success in mainstream American comic books. And obviously a lot of these comic books featured the superhero archetype. And as you can see, these are some examples like the Flash, the Amazing Spider-Man. And these are things that we're really, I'm sure if anybody grew up with comics books, are pretty familiar with. But it was around this, and the silver age of comic books were kind of considered to span from 1956 to circa 1970, apparently. And so it's very, obviously very, a lot of these comic books use a lot of bright colors, classic stories like The Green Goblin's Last Hand. I'm sure you've heard about The Green Goblin. But despite all of this, there's this kind of awakening in the comic book industry, or fringes in the comic book industry, where people are kind of clamoring for alternative, material, such as, R. Crumb. R. Crumb is this famous comic book artist. I really, really adore him. He's an underground, well, he's not so much underground. He's actually extremely famous and rich. But he kind of represented the vanguard of underground comic artists who are basically rebelling against mainstream comic books and the comic book code authority. And they wanted to explore more mature subjects like drug use, sexuality, and violence and such, especially for our Crumb sexuality, since he always talked about, like he always drew women, and how much he loved women, and also how much of a loser he was, basically, which is kind of pretty prevalent in a lot of his work. So anyway, so he was at the vanguard of, underground comics. And they were kind of like a reaction towards these mainstream comics. And they also, I really think R. Crumb and his ilk are kind of are the proto, like the forefathers of graphic novels, because they started exploring stories that were not just spandex. They were exploring like personal stuff, weird stuff, things that you wouldn't see in mainstream comic books. So he's not considered, and he's also considered not just to be an underground comic book artist, but also in alternative comics, which is basically the same thing. They're kind of interchangeable. He was responsible for Fritz the Cat and this guy in the yellow robe, Mr. Natural. And there's another alternative comic artist or writer that I really like, called Harvey Picard. He did a series of comics books called American Splendor. And there was another alternative comic book magazine type product from Europe called Raw, which was also seminal in the making of the comic book and graphic novel as we know them today. Mad Magazine. There's a question about Mad Magazine. Is Mad Magazine a graphic comic book, and when did it first appear? Yeah, I don't really touch on Mad Magazine. Well, I don't touch Mad Magazine at all in this lecture, but I believe it came out in the mid 20th century, and it wouldn't be considered a graphic novel because I'll get into the kind of definition of a graphic novel, but it's basically a magazine of basically caricatures and comic strips, but it's not considered a graphic novel. And I'll get into that definition later. So I had to go through all that like kind of backstory just to talk about what are graphic novels, because all that history kind of just basically builds up to the graphic novels that we're going to look at right now. So I found this definition of what are graphic novels from the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. I mean, I don't really agree with this definition because I really feel like comic books and graphic novels the word can be interchanged, but graphic novels have a more kind of, I don't know, more elite sounding kind of tone to it. But I do agree with that graphic novels are generally standalone stories with more complex plots. And that's why something like Mad Magazine is not a graphic novel. Okay. But a collection of short stories or collection of comic books that are put into a graphic novel can be considered a graphic novel. And I'll get into that. And I have a couple of other definitions that I found that I thought would be helpful. That a graphic novel, as the name suggests, is a novel that tells a complete story via illustrations, and it has a beginning, middle, and end. And it's basically like a novel. And it makes it more longer, more substantive than a comic book. And I guess, and that's how, and I think this is like a better definition, because a comic book is a serialized excerpt from a larger narrative. And it's kind of hard to jump into a comic book series in the middle of it compared to a graphic novel where you can just start it like a novel from beginning to end. These are other characteristics of a graphic novel: clear beginning, middle, and end, a central narrative or A story supplemented by optional B stories, character development and personal journeys, thematic messaging, precise, carefully considered dialogue and narration. And also, obviously, the obvious distinction between graphic novels and text-based novels is that graphic novels permit their images to do vast majority of storytelling with dialogue bubbles and narration boxes to help elaborate the story. Okay. And I thought this was pretty good. The differences between a graphic novel and comic book. They are longer than comic books, and they cover a wider range of genres and subject matters, such as like The Best We Can Do, which is about the Vietnamese refugee crisis. And again, comic books in their purest definition contain excerpts of serialized narratives, and it can be difficult to read a comic book if you haven't read the comic that comes directly before it in the series. It's kind of like jumping. Comic books are kind of like soap operas. You know, you jump, it's kind of hard to get into the middle of a soap opera if you don't know the backstory. And that's kind of how I find comic books to function. But graphic novels are a bit different than that. But as I'll show you in the later part of the lecture, is that you can kind of interchange comic books and graphic novels, because some graphic novels do have superheroes and stuff, and they do take stories from like other comic books. Okay. Also, comic books are produced with greater frequency than graphic novels, often arriving on a weekly or monthly schedule, usually on a Wednesday, by the way. If you hang around a comic book shop, Wednesdays are the days when new comic books drop. Okay, so getting back to the term graphic novel, there was an historian that termed Richard Kyle. He first coined the term graphic novel in an essay in 1964, and the term gained popularity over the years, especially with the publication of Will Eisner's A Contract with God. Now, Will Eisner is a pretty famous comic book artist and writer, and he worked in mainstream comic books, but then he became very disillusioned with the industry because he wanted to elevate comic books into a work of art. And that was really, really difficult, obviously, because he was basically like a prophet in the desert and nobody was really listening to him. But he was a pioneer in graphic novels. And one day he decided to, go on his own path, and he put together this really stunning graphic novel called A Contract with God. And I'm not sure when it came out. I think, yeah, it was published in 1978. And basically, this book and a couple of others kind of laid the foundation of what a graphic novel constitutes. And so this was published in 1978, and this book is basically a series of short stories revolving around poor Jewish characters who live in a tenement in New York City. And he produced 2 sequels set in the same tenement: A Life Force, one book called A Life Force in 1988, and Dropsy Avenue in 1995. Though the term graphic novel did not originate with Will Eisner, the book is credited with popularizing its use. Also, just an aside, what I think is interesting is that a lot of pioneering comic book artists and graphic novelists are Jewish. And I think that's why they, and I also like to think that's why the Comic Book Code Authority came out, and why that book, that Frederick Wertham book came out, is that not only were they attacking comic books as a genre and saying they were vulgar and such, but also I thought it was kind of a subtle anti-Semitic move as well, because a lot of comic books, like pioneering comic book artists and pioneering graphic novelists, are Jewish. And I'm sure there's like probably a sociological paper saying why a lot of Jewish men gravitated to the comic book form. And maybe because it was like a really easy and accessible way to put your message out, be part of the mainstream culture and such. Anyway, so we're going to move on. This is Mouse. These are a couple of pages from Mouse by Art Spiegelman. He's also another Jewish comic book artist. And Mouse is probably, I would think, the granddaddy of the graphic novel that really put graphic novels on the map. It's by Art Spiegelman, American cartoonist. He's also Jewish. And this story was serialized from 1980 to 1991. And it depicts Spiegelman interviewing his father about his experience as a Polish Jew and a Holocaust survivor. And what was really great and interesting about this comic or graphic novel is that it depicted Jews as mice, Germans as cats, Poles as pigs, Americans as dogs, the British as fish, the French as frogs, of course, and the Swedish as deer. And it really is a masterpiece, by the way. And in 1992, it became the first and so far only graphic novel to win a Pulitzer Prize. And the book is basically part memoir, biography, history, fiction, and autobiography. And it's really compelling stuff. And I've read it and it's made me cry. And I really, really recommend people read it. In fact, recently, I think in the past couple of months, it was banned somewhere in the South, which was pretty ridiculous. Somewhere in Tennessee because of the subject matter, but I think is one of the most important books in recent history, and not just as a graphic novel, but as a piece of history, as a piece of memoir. Okay. The next one is Ghost World. This is another like seminal graphic novel. This is by Daniel Clowes. It's was serialized between 1993 and March 1987. And basically it's a fictional book. This is not a memoir, but it's kind of like a modern day Catcher in the Rye. The story is about two kind of disaffected teenagers. They just graduated from high school in the early 1990s, and they spend their days wandering around aimlessly around their town and basically hating on people, criticizing pop culture and stuff. And it's kind of like a lot of dark Black humor. And it was made also into a really great movie, by the way. And it was one of the first movies with Carlin Johansson in it, by the way. So this is another seminal piece of work in the graphic novel genre. Now, even though graphic novels can encompass, various subject matters, they also encompassed, superheroes. So these are two comic books that are, or comic books / graphic novels that are, I think, really important in the development of graphic novels genre. Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, as you can see on the left, and Alan Moore's Watchmen. Even though they deal with superhero comics, I think they're considered graphic novels because they have an alternative edge to them. Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns is basically an alternate version of Batman, an aging Batman in his 50s who comes back from retirement to fight crime. It's a pretty dark, satirical comic book. I remember reading it as a kid. Sorry, mom and dad. I read it as a kid when I was 12 or 13, and it influenced me as an artist because a lot of the layouts and the way Frank Miller draws figures is really pretty stunning. But also it was such a crazy, intense story. And even though I don't really look at Frank Miller as a model to emulate in life or deed, since he's a pretty controversial person, I still think this is a really important comic book in the evolution of graphic novels. And another one is, of course, Alan Moore's Watchmen, which is also kind of, I'm sure you're familiar with the movie Watchmen, but anyway, it originated with this graphic novel / comic book, Watchmen, and it's basically this story that basically deconstructs the idea of superheroes. It's a pretty dark, story where set in a time where on alternative America, where the United States won the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal was never exposed. And the world is edging towards World War III with Soviet Union, which doesn't sound too dissimilar to what we're going through right now. But this is a really important comic book, and I really recommend reading it too. And again, Alan Moore is an important person in shaping graphic novels and basically introducing the concept of, telling stories that are not just rah, 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 superheroes are awesome, but let's tell some complex stories, basically. This is another example. He did a graphic novel about Jack the Ripper, and this was published in serial form from 1989 to 1998 and put together into a graphic novel called From Hell. And it's basically set during the Whitechapel murders of the late Victorian era. And the novel speculates upon the identity and motives of Jack the Ripper. And some of it's fictional, some of it's based on true facts, and some of it's fictionalized, but it's a pretty good story. And it was made into a movie, I believe, with Johnny Depp. You can correct me if I'm wrong. The next one is Neil Gaiman. He's a writer, a British writer, who's fairly famous for his short fiction novels, but he's also famous for being a writer for the Sandman series, which are comic books about this character called Sandman. And he also did a bunch of comic books with one of my favorite artists named Dave McKean. And this is one example. It's called Black Orchid. And Black Orchid is a character who basically has a symbiotic relationship with plants. And this is one of his earliest works, actually, as a comic book writer with Dave McKean. And Black Orchid is kind of like a mix between a graphic novel and comic book. It's stunningly beautifully written and drawn, and they really elevate basically the comic book genre into something more. And I feel that's why it treads into basically graphic novel territory, because I always think like comic books have kind of a more vulgar tone to them, and graphic novels are more elevated, and graphic novels win awards and stuff. So and I think this is where he like basically this book is, I feel like, expands and elaborates and enhances what comics books can be, and they become art, they become graphic novels, and they're more than just some throwaway comic book. Okay. So anyways, now we're into the modern period, which is the contemporary period. Because of all this great work people have been doing over the last, 40 years, I feel like graphic novels are really coming into their own. There's a greater appetite for graphic novels. I forgot what the figures were, but graphic novels are probably one of the fastest growing genres of literature right now. People are hungry to read them. People are hungry to sell them. People are hungry to make them, and it's thanks to obviously the pioneers like Will Eisner, Alan Moore, Art Spiegelman. Because of them, we have this like whole flourishing, genre of graphic novels, and they cover so much material. They're no more than just spandex. Basically. And I just have a couple examples here, recent examples that came out. In the lower right-hand corner is a book actually authored by John Lewis. It's about the Selma March, and it obviously features MLK. And then I have more examples here of graphic novels that came out. The one that I'm most familiar with, obviously, is Mart Spiegelman, Mouse is There, but there's this book called Boxers, which is about the Boxer Rebellion, that also won awards, and I recommend that. So I wanted to showcase this graphic novel by Marjane Satrapi. She's a Persian, Iranian-born French graphic novelist, cartoonist, illustrator, film director, and children's book author. And she basically put herself in the map with this graphic novel called Persepolis. And it's about basically her childhood in Iran and Austria during and after the Islamic Revolution. And Persepolis the name is a reference to the ancient capital of the Persian Empire. And I recommend it. It's pretty moving. And then she turned it into an animated movie, which is also stunning. And this is a genre that kind of is close to what the big read is, the best we can do. And then there's another artist I wanted to feature. I'm sure if you have like teenagers, girl teenagers, you're probably familiar with this author. Her name is Diane Tuggemeyer. I think that's how you say her name. She is a New York Times bestselling graphic novelist and cartoonist, and she really put herself on the map with this book called Smile. And it started first off as a webtoon, but it's basically about a girl who's just enjoying her life, and then she has a terrible accident during a Girl Scouts trip where she trips and falls, severely injuring her two front teeth. And because of that, she has to go through this awful journey with braces, surgery, embarrassing headgear, and even a retainer with fake teeth attached to it. And it won major awards. It won a Will Eisner Award. It's a New York Times bestseller. And basically, it just shows how comic books and graphic novels have evolved to not just tackle, like, obviously superheroes, but also heavy subjects like Holocaust, but now even to like kind of slice of life stories like being a teenager. And that's really a great sign that that people are turning to graphic novels for these kinds of stories, that the graphic novel genre can include so much, so many different stories, not just one thing. Anyway, so I wanted to delve into a couple of other things that are kind of like related to graphic novels. I wanted to talk a little bit about manga. Manga is basically comics or graphic novels from Japan. And what's great about Japanese culture, and also that's true for French culture, is that comic books and graphic novels are a widely respected art form. Everybody reads them, from little kids to senior citizens. Okay, and that's kind of, I think, true also in France, where there is a huge comic book industry, and it's not seen as kind of like second-rate art like it is seen in America for some reason. But manga is pretty important. It's kind of like a corollary to how graphic novels are seen or done in America. Manga encompasses action, adventure, detective stories, drama, and romance. And one of the most seminal manga in Japan is Akira. And I wanted to show this, I guess, it's a disturbing scene from Akira where basically a bomb goes off. But it's one of my favorite stories. And then another great manga from Japan is Berserk. Maybe if you have a teenage son or a daughter, they probably know about Berserk, but basically it's a really famous manga about set kind of in a fantastical medieval Europe, dark fantasy. And it's actually gone on to influence a lot of different, properties and video games and other books. But unfortunately, the artist died recently. I think he died. Yeah, he died last year. Isn't that terrible? And so that's one, like basically manga in Japan kind of is kind of a corollary to the graphic novel evolution in English speaking, America, English speaking countries and in America. Another thing I wanted to show is Webtoons. Webtoons is kind of like another avenue of comic book making, and a lot of great graphic novels have come out of the Webtoon world. Basically, Webtoons are comic strips or comics on the web, and a lot of the most popular ones have been collated into graphic novels. And a famous one is Lore Olympus, which is on Webtoons. It's a story about Greek gods, and it's really about the relationship between Persephone and Hades. And I recommend this story. If you can find it, just download the Webtoons app. It's really compelling stuff. It made me cry. It's a beautiful romance, and it also delves into like mature subject matter like sexual assault and stuff, but it's a really great, well done story. And I feel like it expands the graphic novel genre in that it's, because it's on the web, it's widely available. Like it just it just adds more to the whole tapestry of just visual narrative. And then I wanted to like touch on another thing, just as a kind of ending note. I really think that memes, the internet memes that you see on the internet, are kind of related to graphic novels in that they do tell stories and such, and they spread ideas, and they remind me of graphic novels in that way, that they're another, or basically they're a really great manifestation of visual narrative and storytelling. And what I've been very interested in is how memes have been spreading in relation to, for example, the Ukrainian War, and how they've been used to basically shape public opinion. Oh, I'll go on to memes again. I'm mistaken. The next section, I wanted to talk about zines. Sorry, guys. Zines are basically DIY magazines, and they're kind of related to graphic novels that some graphic novels started off as zines, and basically to like DIY little magazines that people would make on photocopy paper. Okay, and they're self-published, usually produced via copy machine and such. Okay, and you can actually find them in a lot of small press events. And they were also responsible for spreading, you know, alternative ideas like socialism or feminist ideas like Riot Girl. And you can find them on Etsy or eBay. A lot of people are still doing zines. Zines are still pretty popular, but they're kind of related to graphic novels in that way that, you know, you can kind of interchange one or the other depending on the length of the zine story. Oh, and getting back to memes again, sorry guys, I got mixed up. So I've been really interested in how memes have been used to shape public opinion, and they remind, and I guess you can draw kind of a line from graphic novels to memes, because they're another way to tell a story. And I thought this is a really great meme that I saw about the Ukrainian War, and basically this message, this meme reflects the Ukrainian flag, and then you have a guy with a stinger that down a helicopter. This came out like very recently. And this is another meme that I saw that was cool. It takes basically Eastern European iconography and puts a javelin or an anti-tank launcher on these ladies, and these are spreading wild. And what's great is they tell a story. You know, and obviously they're there to shape public opinion to boost more the morale of Ukrainian troops. Oh, and I thought this is interesting. This is another meme that I saw. So it's kind of, well, obviously it's a webcomic, and it's a parody of Lord of the Rings, where they say that in this parody, Frodo is Ukraine, and he said, and he basically goes, "I will do it. I will face Russia," and then all these people in the fellowship are going, "You have my sword," which is America. "You have my bow," the British say, and then the EU says, "You can have my axe." And at the end, he has all those things, but they're not helping him. They just gave him the tools, and he has to go and face, I don't know, Sauron or Mordor with all these tools alone. Poor thing. Good luck. Anyway, so that's really about the end of it. Any questions?
Sharon, thank you so much for fitting all of that graphic novel history into under an hour.
I can't believe that too.
That's quite remarkable. Julie has a question for you. Are you familiar with, in quotes, text comics, which first began by Wilhelm Busch in Germany with the introduction of Max and Morris? There are 2 books with hundreds of sequential comics, the first printed in 1865.
I'm afraid that I'm not familiar with that, but I have heard of Max and Morris. But yeah, but I've heard of the name William Busch. I'm sorry if I'm not too much help, but you can see that even back in the mid 19th century, people were into sequential art.
Yeah, yeah. Kathleen had a comment earlier about mouths again, which is interestingly a hot topic again with schools banning it.
Oh yeah. Okay, so I'm looking up, but apparently it's in Tennessee. Athens, Tennessee, the McMinn County Board voted in January to remove mouse from its 8th grade curriculum, which I think is really ridiculous, because it's an important book, I think, to read. Okay, what are text comics? You know what? Text comics, I think, are just comics with, it's pretty self-explanatory. They're basically comics with just basically they're comics that have text at the bottom. The stories are told in captions below the images, with or without the use of speech balloons, and that's kind of like how early comic strips were conveyed. Oh,
okay. There's Donald. Body shape and position to bring out emotions are noteworthy in your examples. Is this an important aspect of these novels?
Yeah, because basically the images are doing the heavy lifting of narration, more so obviously than the words. And so that's why it's really important to be an artist and to be a really good artist. So
I am just very giddy over here. I don't know if you can tell, but I have been I've been a comic book fan since the 90s or even earlier. And many of you probably don't know this because I don't talk about it much. But as a librarian, I do borrow a lot of my books, but I do have a graphic novel collection. I do.
Oh, that's awesome.
Those are ones I buy, and I have a lot of the ones that you've mentioned. I wanted to make a push for also understanding comics, though.
Oh, like good.
On by Scott McCloud. And Donald, you touched upon the importance of body language and imagery. Understanding comics has been used in college classrooms for those who want to learn about the genre, and it really is. It breaks down the elements of the comic book and how to read it and the artistry behind creating the comic book as well. So I think I know Sharon, you're familiar with it.
I have that book. I have a couple of books. Scott McCloud is a really important comic books scholar. He's he really elevates the art form by explaining it and saying why this is important, how they do it, what are the mechanics. It's more than just pictures, and he breaks it down.
Yes, and it's a graphic novel format explaining the graphic novel. So there you go.
Yeah, basically. I think what's great about all these scholars and artists is that I think compared to Japan or France, where comic books and graphic novels are seen in high esteem, in America, they're not seen in the same kind of light. We're kind of shedding that right now. We're kind of in a weird time period where we're shedding that, kind of notion that they're vulgar. They're not vulgar. They're another way to tell a story. They're just as valid as books with just words, and I read both. I read a lot of books and I read a lot of graphic novels, and they enrich my understanding of the world. And graphic novels are a high art form. I basically wanted to convey that they're able to tell a story, and they're not just superheroes, but they can tell like really compelling subjects, such as the Holocaust or the Vietnamese refugee crisis. So I think we have some questions in the chat.
Let's start with Diane. I'm interested in nonfiction editorial graphic novels like Rake by Dan Newman, and recently saw graphic perspectives in the New England Journal of Medicine, very mainstream, and now a routine part of the journal.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, I'm interested in that too. There's a lot of, so I'm actually familiar with that book by Dan Newman. It's called Unrig, How to Fix Our Broken Democracy. And it's a great graphic novel, I guess, or a graphic book, a piece of really great comic journalism that explains in a visual way, with obviously a lot of words, how to be a better, citizen of America, and I do recommend that book. It's also beautifully, put together.
Yes, we do have it at the library. A number of the graphic novels you've mentioned, Sharon, we do have at our library for those who are interested.
Okay, great. And also I wanted to touch on is that the graphic novels are not just about fiction or memoir, but they can be journalism, such as the book that I just talked about, Unrigged by Dan Newman, a piece of journalism or commentary.
Mhm.
Okay, other questions?
Yes. Leslie, are you familiar with Mark Criley's work? And
Oh, unfortunately I'm not, but I'll look up that person.
yes, you have a lot of richness in the graphic novel genre. I do recall, like, and even in the bookstore, it's the graphic novel section has expanded
Oh,
significantly.
thank
There are
God.
a lot of them now. Julie has a question. Is there any backstory to T-Boy's learning how to do all the incredible artwork in her graphic novel? Well, Julie, I don't know how many of you here know, but we did land a virtual talk with the author of The Best We Could Do as part of the big read. So we can ask T-Boy herself, and we will have her speak to us virtually as part of the big read on Tuesday, April 5th at 6:30 p.m.
I also read an interview with her that she was inspired by other autobiographical graphic novels like Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which we just looked at, and Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis. So maybe in addition to reading the best we can do, you can read Mouse and Persepolis, which are both giants in the graphic novel genre and just giants in literature, basically. I
Yeah.
think so I know Art Spiegelman's Mouse won a Pulitzer, but someone quipped recently on Twitter, they're wondering, like, has anyone done the Great American Graphic Novel yet? And I retweeted it. I'm like, no, I don't think anybody has. So I'm waiting for it. Maybe I'll do it. I don't know.
That's wonderful. Any further questions? I like to add, when you were referring to the Jewish authors and illustrators, that the original Superman comic, Action Comics, Joel Shuster and Jerry Spiegel, I hope I didn't mix up their names, but they were both Jewish. And I don't know how many people here are fans of Michael Chabon, but his book, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, are loosely based on the founding of Superman, for those who are interested. And when Superman was when he first came into creation, he fought Nazis, basically. He couldn't fly yet. You saw on the cover that Sharon provided that he could lift a car. He could probably run as fast as a train. But it sort of shows the evolution of superheroes, similarly to the oral tradition, how they reflect our society at that time period. Right?
Sorry about that. Yeah, Art Spiegelman had a great, I think, op-ed in The Guardian in 2019, where he talks about how basically superheroes were shaped by the rise of fascism, and it's no coincidence that a lot of the creators were Jewish, because they saw these superheroes as saviors to save them from, Nazis and fascists.
Yeah.
And I think also that's why corollary why there's a lot of elements in mainstream culture that look down on comic books. They thought it's vulgar, and maybe there was some an anti-Semitic bent to that kind of distaste from the larger WASP society. You know what I mean? And that's why we had the Comic Code Authority. But thankfully, that's changed because of these pioneers, these Jewish men comic book artists.
Well, Sharon, I don't think we have any further questions, but that was such a delight. And, I just wanted to also mention that this upcoming Thursday, we are having a storyteller, Joanne Epley-Schmidt, running an interactive presentation where she read The Best We Could Do. And she, as a storyteller, saw a lot of parallels between the graphic novel and the art of storytelling. And I hinted at that with the Superman background. But if you're interested in learning more about how graphic novels have a lot in common with oral storytelling, then we welcome you to join that session this upcoming Thursday.
Oh, and can I just have one parting message?
Sure.
Okay, I hope that people see, like for people who are new to the graphic novels and who are kind of leery of getting into it, I hope you see that it's a serious genre, that there's a lot there. It's just like, regular book genre. There's a lot they can pick and choose to see what you like. And it's not just superheroes, that you can pick up a book that will really appeal to you. And it's an art form. It's not just something throwaway or disposable, but it's in fact, graphic novels can cover important subjects, and they're worthy of, if not veneration, then at least respect.
Well said. Well said. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this lovely Sunday afternoon. Until the next time on Zoom, thank you so much again, Sharon, for offering a lovely background on graphic novels. Goodbye, everyone.
Okay, bye.